ProPublica's editor-in-chief, Stephen Engelberg, up next on Carpe Diem. Hello and welcome to Carpe Diem. I'm Merrill Brown, Director of the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. Joining me today is Stephen Engelberg, a history graduate of Princeton University, who is currently the editor-in-chief of ProPublica, an independent nonprofit online investigative newsroom that distributes compelling stories on the web and with mainstream media partners such as the New York Times, WNYC, ABC's 2020, and CBS's 60 Minutes. He oversees the organization's day-to-day editorial operations, long-term projects, and web strategy. Before joining ProPublica, he worked for the Norfolk Virginian Pilot, the Dallas Morning News, and the New York Times, where he established the investigative unit there while he was a reporter based in Washington, D.C. and Warsaw, Poland. He also worked for the Portland Oregonian, where he supervised investigative projects and news coverage. In 2012, he was elected to the 19-member Pulitzer Prize Board, composed of leading editors and news executives from media outlets across the nation. Thanks for joining me, Stephen.
My pleasure.
Tell us about ProPublica and a little bit about its history and mission.
Well, ProPublica has its beginnings with the dream of two people, Herb and Marion Sandler, who were bankers in California and philanthropists. And in 2007, I think they saw pretty clearly the coming storm in the world of the media. And they were in the process of kind of going on to the next phase of their life. They were able to sell their very successful bank at a good profit. And they pledged to put a substantial amount of that into their philanthropy and specifically into a new kind of organization that would do journalism and have impact on the world around us. And that was their idea. It wasn't, let's go do good journalism. It was, let's go do journalism with impact. And they believed specifically that investigative reporting was an arena that was likely to be pinched as the media was disrupted by the internet. So that's the beginnings of it.
And tell us where it is today and how you assess its number of years of operations.
Well, we're very fortunate. I mean, we started with a sort of pledge of $10 million a year from the Sandlers to begin the organization and to build something. And with that, we have now created an organization that has about 23 reporters, an additional number of journalists, all in all about 40 employees, doing a regular sort of stream of stories that we hope make a difference and bring impact. The sort of fortunate part about having the Sandlers was that it allowed us to create a product and not worry about the funding in the first 3 years, which we did. We have since then gone out and tried to raise money from foundations and individuals and small donors, and we've gone from a point where the Sandlers were 95% of our funding in the first year down to about 30% this year. And in the world of nonprofit journalism, or any kind of nonprofit, I think having a diversified base of contributors and supporters is absolutely crucial, because you never want to be in a position where if something happens to your one donor, you're out of business. And I think it was really crucial in our world to be able to create stories, to do journalism, to show that the model could actually work. And I think that's what helped persuade funders to be supportive.
Are the funders particularly supportive, and is your mission enhanced by what is fair to say is the collapse of investigative journalism at many large news organizations?
Well, it certainly is an important part of what we say to people. What's happened, as we all know, is that the number of reporters in legacy news organizations has shrunken dramatically as the ad base has shrunken. And investigative reporting is expensive. It's potentially not profitable in the sense that you do stories that don't necessarily turn out, so you spend a lot of time and you drill the so-called dry holes. And also, you know, the business model of investigative reporting is to annoy, in a sense, the most powerful people in your community if you're doing it right. And so I think for a number of reasons, papers sort of with their backs to the wall, newspapers particularly, have found themselves cutting back on this. And so we've tried to step into the breach in a number of ways. I mean, I would say in fairness that the picture is shifting in the media landscape. We have new entrants into the world of investigative reporting. There are more nonprofits since we've started, and some other organizations have come along which started with one model and are now adding this. I mean, you see even an organization like BuzzFeed, very popular internet site known for a kind of humorous and ironic take on things, has now started an investigative unit with serious intent, and they hired one of my editors, in fact, to run it. So, I think eventually people's hunger for information may give us a market-driven partial response to this, but I don't necessarily see us ever replacing what we had before, which was robust investigative reporting at a lot of newspapers and radio stations around the country.
Do you see the business model you've created with ProPublica as being instructive about journalism in general, or is it very specific to investigative reporting?
No, I think it has broader application. I think, in point of fact, actually, what we're doing turns out on some level to be more difficult, because if you're doing something that's sort of specifically driven toward a particular kind of content, we have a new thing coming in now looking at criminal justice, you're going to have people in that field come every day to say, well, what's new on criminal justice? We're investigative reporting. It's a technique rather than a subject. So we build our stories and audience sort of one story at a time. We do an environmental story, people come to read that. Those people are not coming every day to ProPublica to look for their morning helping of investigative reporting. So in some ways, I think it would be easier to build a site based upon a sort of focused subject matter.
Your reference to criminal justice, I assume, was about former New York Times editor Bill Keller's new project. Why don't you tell us just briefly about that?
I mean, Bill is actually a former colleague and friend of mine. We talked before he took this job. He sort of has had every job at the New York Times you possibly could have. He was a foreign correspondent. He was a foreign editor, a managing editor, an executive editor of the New York Times, and then a columnist. And he said, well, why should I consider this when the offer was on the table? And I said, that building something from scratch is perhaps the single most satisfying thing you can ever do in the world of journalism and sort of creating things. And the idea behind this is that they are going to have multiple sort of entry levels for readers. They're going to have stories about what's happening on a kind of daily basis. They're going to aggregate news on criminal justice and the justice system. And then they're going to do deep dive stories that will expose things people didn't know about. And I wish them all the luck in the world. I think the world, readers will benefit from this kind of thing.
ProPublica has had impact already in the marketplace. In the journalism marketplace, you've won the first Pulitzer Prizes ever given to online-based organizations. What would you say is the leading journalistic accomplishment, awards notwithstanding?
Well, I think the things I'm most proud of is stories that we have done that have brought change, real change. We did some work on what happened in New Orleans with the police department after Katrina, and those stories eventually led, first of all, to the Justice Department essentially taking over the police department because it was in such a state of disorganization. The stories exposed the fact that 10 people had been shot in a period of days after Katrina by the police. They led to criminal prosecutions and convictions. And so I think those kinds of things, and we've done several different kinds of things in that arena where you actually change something. I think that's our goal, and when you do it, it's very satisfying. The other thing I would point to is work we've been doing on payments to doctors. We called it Dollars for Docs. It's sort of signature kind of thing for us because we were able to gather publicly available data on payments that pharmaceutical companies make to doctors to give speeches, $3,000, $5,000 to sort of read a bunch of slides. And we were able to sort of expose how much money was being paid to people, which companies were doing it, the magnitude of this. And over the last 2 years, as we've written these stories, and they've appeared all over the country, the pharmaceutical companies have begun to back away from this practice. The big ones are now down 60, 70% below what they were when we started. So I feel like that's really making a difference, and we've also given patients transparency. You can now go into a doctor's office, go to our website, and look up if your doctor has been receiving money from certain companies and what that might have to do with what the drugs are being pushed at you. So I think that's a very valuable thing for readers and for the public.
That's very exciting. You've been accused from time to time by the right of being left-leaning, and yet you've done lots of work on one of the right's favorite stories, the IRS story, and are knowledgeable about that. How do you assess both ProPublica's, the criticism of ProPublica, and then the IRS story, which remains very much bubbling around the media, especially from the Fox News world?
Well, it's interesting. I think that when you do a story that one side dislikes, they immediately tar you with a brush. We did some very interesting work on the sort of gerrymandering of congressional districts. And our big case study was the state of California, which is ruled entirely by Democrats. And so we wrote a really quite in-depth expose about how the California Democrats had conspired to make sure that all the incumbents would be elected and Democrats would rule California forever. And the state Democratic Party chairman responded with words I can't use on television about our coverage. And you know, that reflected a broader, I think, obscenity-laced viewpoint of the story on the left in California. And you know, on the other hand, when we did similar stories about what was going on, say in North Carolina, where the Republicans were doing it, we had the right sort of very angry at us. And I think this is just typical. On the IRS story from the very beginning, we have been writing about this so-called dark money, the notion that you can give money through nonprofits, a different kind of nonprofit than we are, and that can then in turn get into the political process, can run ads, pay for ads, and never have to disclose its donors. And the amounts of money in this are absolutely staggering, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And our reporter, Kim Barker, has worked very hard to bring to light some things. Typically, when we write about the Koch brothers, we get people angry on one side. When she writes about the Democrats, we get people angry on the other. I think it's, you know, frankly, the cost of doing business. Now, I will say, and I don't agree with this, there's a sort of old saw in journalism that says, if both sides are mad at you, you must be doing okay. Well, there are two possibilities there. If both sides are mad at you, you may be doing okay, or you may be doing wrong to both of them. And I think, you know, you shouldn't necessarily take comfort in the fact that people are angry at you. You have to sort of look at why they're angry and whether they're actually right about what they're angry about.
I mentioned a moment ago that the IRS story, which you know a fair amount about at ProPublica, continues to bubble in Congress, much conflict around Congressman Issa and recent events in his House subcommittee. What do you think about the IRS story? Do you think we know all we as citizens need to know about it? Or do you think, as the Obama people do, that it's much ado about nothing?
Well, we, of course, have a bit part in this, and I should explain to your viewers sort of what it is. One of the techniques that my reporter Kim Barker uses, because this is a very arcane area of coverage, is that the IRS does not tell you when someone in this field gets their tax exemption, which is an important step. You know, they have to apply for it, and they have to say, well, we're not political, we're educational, and we're going to do all these nice things. And then the IRS reviews, and then ultimately they don't say anything. So the way you find this out is that you FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request, the document applying for the exemption. And every week that it's not approved, they say, we can't give it to you, it's still under discussion. And then one day, they send it back to you and they say, here's the application, because these guys have been approved, you can now read their application. So that's how you find out if someone's actually been approved. So as a result of this, Kim files hundreds and hundreds of these Freedom of Information Act requests every month, and most of them come back rejected. When one comes back accepted, we know what's going on. So she filed requests for a bunch of groups that we knew hadn't been accepted. And one day we got an envelope from the IRS, and it had the applications in it, and we quickly figured out that they actually were still under adjudication. So Congressman Issa has said this was a deliberate leak because of the 12 or so groups. Most of them were right-wing, though some of them weren't. And you know, he has impugned the sort of integrity of the IRS here. We ourselves have tried to look into this, and we have no evidence that we can find that this was a mistake or a deliberate act. We just don't know. And we've asked, Congressman Issa has claimed it's a deliberate act. We've said, well, give us some evidence, and we're still waiting. He has promised us to provide us with the evidence. That was about 9-10 months ago, and he said we'd have it any time now. And you know, if Congressman Issa, if you're listening right now, we're still waiting. We'd love to know, and if he can provide us evidence that this was a deliberate act by a politically motivated person at the IRS, we will run that story. So Congressman Issa, come on down.
To my larger question, though, are you, as a supervising editor, comfortable that we know enough as citizens about the IRS scandal, or do you share the White House view that it is much ado about nothing and everything there is to learn about Lois Lerner and the various IRS offices is now in the public domain?
Well, no investigative editor is ever comfortable that we know everything we want to know. As a sort of more global statement, so far, from the evidence that we have available so far, this seems to me to be a lot more much ado about nothing than anything else. In fact, by my lights, the larger scandal in all of this is how these groups continue to skirt the federal requirements, which state that these groups are supposed to spend no more than a minority of their time on politics. And in fact, many of them that we've written about spend 90 to 100% of their money on politics. So I think the real scandal here is not politically motivated application of the law, but the lack of application of the law.
Similarly, in the 2014 political debate, you mentioned the Koch brothers a moment ago. Much talk in Congress and within the press in recent weeks, which will continue all the way to the off-year election this November, about the quote-unquote buying of Congress, particularly by the two Koch brothers. How do you look at that issue, and what should ProPublica be doing to shed light on it?
Well, I think we're doing what we're trying to do already, which is to just bring more transparency to how the money moves and how it's spent. We recently did a very interesting article on the Koch brothers' efforts in the 2012 campaign and their money man, a gentleman named Sean Noble from Arizona. The fact is that in every race that we could trace in which they made major investments, their candidate lost. So on the one hand, it's actually hard to say that the Koch brothers are buying Congress. If they're buying it, it's not going very well. In the larger sense, I think that the money in politics issue is a tremendous challenge for our democracy. I think many of the things that are happening around us or not happening, or problems that are not being addressed, reflect the sort of influence of money and the voracious need of all politicians to raise it 24/7, off-season or not. And that's something we're going to continue to stay focused on. And I think all we can ask at this point is to try to bring transparency to things. It's worth remembering, because we've written about this, that in the Citizens United decision, Justice Anthony Kennedy, who wrote the 5-4 opinion, said that corruption is really not a problem with political money because we have disclosure. And he wrote this, with a click of a mouse, he said, you can find out anything you want to know about who's giving to campaigns. This is simply untrue. And Justice Kennedy is wrong. These nonprofits do not disclose their donors, and sometimes one group that doesn't disclose its donors gives to another group that doesn't disclose its donors, which then gives to a third group. So we are watching a sort of massive chain of money changing hands here, and no idea who's behind it all. Companies, individuals, who the heck knows? And so I think transparency is where we come out on this, and we want to use the laws that exist and our reporting techniques to bring more transparency to who's behind these campaigns that you see all the time during the election season.
But you're not really in the solutions business. You're in the reporting business, right? You don't have an editorial page. You don't have opinion columnists. You do have a point of view, clearly, about this question of whether the regulations are sufficient in this regard. How do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, I think in general in our stories, what we try to do is look at what might be called best practices. I mean, in the world of political money, it's a little bit more complicated because, it's a national thing, and what are you going to do? Look at other countries. A lot of our reporting, you can, in fact, we have a lot of things that cross state lines, and you can say, well, in one state, they handle Medicaid this way, but in another state they handle it that way. We've written a lot about fracking. And one of the interesting things we discovered was that in the world of fracking, drilling for natural gas, the companies themselves have best practices. There are better ways to drill in the ground and prevent spills and so on. And we were able to say that certain states require these best practices and certain states don't. So you can point that out. And I think rather than being advocates or having an editorial page, that's what we try to do, is to sort of point to potential solutions that exist in one place but not another. Now, on the campaign finance thing, I think our basic viewpoint, again, which I don't think is really very arguable, is that, as Justice Kennedy has said, transparency and knowing what is being done is the single best disinfectant, the sunlight, and that's what we're trying to bring to the table.
Another big 2014 story that you've been on the fringe of, but since you're a New Jersey resident, you're paying considerable attention to, is George Washington Bridge Governor Christie. How do you look at that story, and in particular the investigative reporting that both preceded it in terms of how Christie was covered and what's transpired since then?
Well, it's a fascinating story, isn't it? I mean, first of all, who would ever have thunk that a traffic jam in New Jersey, which seems to me to be about as common as, rain in Portland where I used to live, that who would have thought a traffic jam could bring down a presidential candidate, if that's what happens? But I think there's been some really kind of teachable moments here. For one thing, the value of having local newspapers. The Bergen Record, or the Record as it's now called, has done an extraordinarily good job at getting on this story and sticking to it, as have other New Jersey outlets, including National Public Radio, including Newark Star Ledger. So you have a really kind of competitive, energetic pursuit of this. I would say, as is always the case in hindsight, it's a shame there wasn't a little bit more of this energy put to the Port Authority before all this started, because I think as we're finding out, and this is hardly a surprise, that an organization that dispenses large construction contracts staffed by patronage appointees of two, not one, but two governors, what could go wrong? And I think, as an investigative type, it would have been, I think, potentially valuable to have more aggressive reporting on this before all this broke. I mean, we kind of got to it in an odd way, which is, traffic cones lead to traffic jams, lead to politics, lead to a sort of full-throated investigation of a long overdue of the Port Authority. But you know what? That's often how we get there in journalism. And I think the citizens of New Jersey are ultimately going to learn some pretty fascinating things about where all those $9 tolls on the bridges are going.
There are some press critics, though, who say the press has been asleep for much of the Christie years, and his position in the state and around the country was largely created through some sense of mythology around him that the press helped foster. Again, as a student of investigative reporting, journalism, and a citizen of New Jersey, what do you think of all that?
Well, I mean, I think it's ever thus. I mean, I think that, you have these local governors who have a record, and they're pretty good at, sort of building an image. And Christie's been exceptional, I think, at creating an image for himself as a kind of plain-talking guy, part of which I think actually comes from who he is and how he conducts himself. I mean, I had the sort of unpleasant or pleasant task, depending on how you look at this, of being overseas in Poland during the 1992 campaign and then returning to the New York Times Washington Bureau in 1993 and be thrown into what was called the Whitewater investigation, which was essentially a holistic look at Bill Clinton's 12 years as governor of Arkansas. And it was fairly shocking to me the amount of things that once we really focused on his record, and Hillary's record, frankly, that you could turn up that was going on in Arkansas that had not figured in the campaign of 1992. And I think the fact of the matter is there is a vetting that goes on when a guy is the governor, and then there's a vetting that goes on when he wants to be in the most powerful executive job on the planet, and it's obviously more intense. So Christie comes under more scrutiny because he's a potential presidential candidate and a plausible one. And so, sure, it would be great if we had known some of this before, but I think, the basic characteristics that we're seeing here of hardball politics and punishing your enemies, I don't think anyone in New Jersey would be shocked to hear Christie was doing that based upon what we've read up till now.
You've brought up the potential Hillary Clinton presidential set of issues, one of which is Whitewater, which you're a scholar of. Are we going to be revisiting Whitewater and the Clintons' behaviors in Arkansas as we near the 2016 campaign?
Well, I was fascinated by that question back in the previous campaign. I kind of expected that when Hillary was running for president the last time, that there would be at least some of that the Republicans would bring it up, somebody would bring it up. Apparently people have moved on from that story, and I guess on some level it's because it was widely perceived as complicated and not amounting to much. We'll see. I think it gets harder and harder as time goes by. I mean, we're now talking about events she'll be running in 2016. We're talking about the events of 1989 in Arkansas in a backwater town. I'd be surprised if it figured large, but then again, who knows?
Would ProPublica be interested in revisiting some of that?
Based on all the time I spent in Arkansas, I would run as far away from it as possible. No, I'm kidding. I think it would depend. I think we'd have to have something new to say. The model of what we would do at ProPublica would be a story that might add something, and so we'd have to have either a tip or a source or a belief that there was something new to say, because I don't feel that we are adding anything to the public good if we just go out and sort of redo our greatest hits.
Okay, and how about ProPublica 5 years from today?
Well, I hope it's a little bit larger, but not tremendously larger. I think that organizations like ours have to be on guard from growing, like Topsy and getting sort of out beyond what they can support. But I would hope that we would be continuing to, exploit the opportunities that we have in the world of data and deep dive reporting. And, I'd like to see it a bit bigger, but, I think it's also a sort of daunting and annual prospect for us. We're not an endowed organization. We don't have a sort of kitty that sort of spins off interest. So we do have to raise upwards of $13 million every single year to support the operation. And so, I can't imagine that we're going to be, for example, double that size in 5 years. I don't know how we would be able to accomplish that.
Any sense that maybe someday we'll see banner and pop-up ads on ProPublica?
We do take advertising. We have not taken pop-up ads. I just think they're annoying, and I think increasingly advertisers think they're annoying. But if you're out there and you're an advertiser, ProPublica does accept ads. It's an interesting problem. If you're sort of a pure play investigative thing, do advertisers want to be right next to very, very hard-hitting content that's kind of, very unsparing? So far, at least, given our smallish size and our content, we're not overwhelmed with ads. And I think in general, the digital advertising business is such that you need to have a level of traffic that's something far away from us. But if anybody wants to advertise, come on down.
And in brief, is there a video future for ProPublica, its own show on CNN perhaps? Or?
I wouldn't rule it out. I think we'd want to be able to do it well. I think in a larger sense, there is a video future for everyone on the web. I think video is increasingly just the way it works. I think the distinction between a text story and a video story and an audio story is being erased every day. You look at the NPR website, there are well-written text versions of their stories. You look at our website, we do pretty well-produced videos and want to do more that accompany our stories. So I think this sort of era of convergence is galloping toward us, and 5, 10 years out, who'll know the difference between a CNN or a New York Times or a ProPublica?
Well, fair enough. Thank you for being here today, Stephen. Great conversation.
Thank you, Merrill.
If you would like more information about ProPublica, visit their website, ProPublica.org. For more about Carpe Diem, you can write to us at the email address on your screen, carpediem@mail.montclair.edu, or call us at 973-655-5158. For Carpe Diem, I'm Merrill Brown. Thanks for watching.